Friends, we're about to start the opening panel of the public forum. It will kick off with a message from the United Nations Secretary General. So it's lights, camera, action. I always wanted to say that one. Thank you.
Dear Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, dear friends, I'm pleased to greet the World Trade Organization Public Forum, a vital space to reflect on the rules of international trade and how they shape the global economy and affect people's lives today and in the future. I salute your focus on a sustainable and inclusive recovery, and especially the imperative to move from ambition to action, finding the right balance between trade that is open, global, and propels growth, and trade that is fair, sustainable, and inclusive is crucial if we are to keep the promise of the 2030 Agenda alive, and that is why your work is so important. Fair trade is not compatible with subsidies and technical barriers that distort markets in favor of developed countries. Free, open global markets are important, but unregulated trade can lead to unsustainable practices and harmful impacts on economies and people. At the same time, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and other measures that limit trade can cause more economic harm than benefit, particularly to small developing countries. The WTO, and this forum in particular, is where we come together to find this balance. I commend the recent agreement on fisheries subsidies, which will make a vital contribution to end illegal fishing, preserving our oceans, and protecting the livelihood of millions and nutrition of billions of people worldwide. We need similar successes to advance across the Sustainable Development Goals. This includes trading arrangements and rules that facilitate the renewables revolution and open opportunities for developing countries to become major exporters of green energy while ensuring affordable access to energy for all. It includes protecting human rights by aligning trade rules with multilateral commitments. It includes trade rules that help manage new technologies and the digital economy. Dear friends, building a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive global economy has never been more critical. And trade is an indispensable catalyst. Let us use the power of trade to help expand opportunities while protecting our fragile planet. And let us do business in a way that creates an enabling environment for trade and investment to deliver sustainable development for all. Thank you.
The Secretary General. Now, our panel. The work that normally is done in this room is at the very nitty-gritty of negotiation, the detail, if you will. But the panel that we're going to present to you today is going to take us a bit higher in a sense than that and look at the macroeconomic, if you like, trade philosophy, trade environment upon which what the negotiations then rest, the direction, if you will. And we have a very distinguished panel. Boholo Kenewendo is, well, described as an economist and a politician, but that really doesn't really fully describe you, does it? I mean, you're the former Minister of Trade in Botswana, the youngest minister. Pull the microphone slightly towards you, switch the microphone on. What's the one thing you want me to know about you?
Oh, my God. that I'm from Botswana. I think that's the number one thing. And second, can I still in a second?
You will anyway, so please.
And then second, that I am very proud to be accompanied by 11 young African economists from Africa here with me.
Put your hands up. Come on, 11. Right. Now, the former minister may be impressed by your presence, but I will only be impressed, and I suspect Mariana will only be impressed when we hear your questions. And we can then hear you activate and get involved. Mariana Mazzucato is she's described as the professor of economics at UCL, but that doesn't really do justice, does it? Because you're also the founder of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. What do you want us to know about you?
That I'm trying to turn on the microphone, to make the word bureaucracy the sexiest word ever.
Oh boy. Cameron Saul is the co-founder of Bottle Top. Again, that really, do switch your microphone on, that doesn't really describe, you can leave them on actually, you can leave them on so that you can join in when ready. Cameron, what do we need to know about you?
The waste is only waste if you waste it.
Well, that sounds good. Pay a lot of money for that.
Well, actually, no. I think what I would like everyone to know about me is how we've always been inspired by humanity's ability to reinvent and support itself through its creativity.
And this is the luxury designs that then you create for products, bags, and this delightful band which we're all wearing and which
Our Together band
is available for a reasonable amount, which will all assist.
Absolutely. So we design using waste materials that support women and indigenous communities around the world. And for us, that's why trade is so fundamental.
Thank you. Soumya Swaminathan is the chief scientist at the WHO, which means that she probably didn't get much sleep last year or the year before, although you've only recently in post. My opening question, we know, it's not so much what I want to know about you, it's, do you agree with the President of the United States that the pandemic is over?
I think, thank you so much for that very neutral question. But I've been asked a lot of questions like that.
Including that one, I'm sure.
Including that one, yes, exactly. Yeah. In New York last week, I was asked exactly that question. And during the course of the pandemic, unfortunately, we were faced with a number of times when different political leaders were making statements that were not based on science and that were at odds with each other. And this ended up confusing people. Now, as far as the pandemic is concerned, I don't think we're out of the pandemic yet. There are still 2/3 of Africans who haven't had their primary course of vaccination. I think this is not something everybody realizes, because you think by now, surely everybody's been vaccinated, but it's not true. Even healthcare workers and the elderly in Africa have not received their first course, let alone a booster. And so there's still lots of vulnerable people. The virus is constantly mutating and changing. We don't know when the next variant will emerge and what it will look like. It could be worse than Omicron, it could be milder. And people's behavior is going to determine a lot of, how this virus continues to transmit. So I think we have the winter in the northern hemisphere ahead of us, which could be risky. And we have to stay cautious, we have to stay prepared. But the one big difference today is we have the tools, we have the knowledge, we have the vaccines, the drugs, the diagnostics that we can, if we use them wisely and equitably, we don't have to suffer the effects of the pandemic.
But I remember at the start of the pandemic, there were those who, at the very early days, before we realized maybe it wasn't even a pandemic, people said, but we're talking about the flu. Mm-hmm. The flu kills 30,000 people in the US every year anyway. So, what was all the fuss? This was in the very early days. Do we end up with COVID being like that? For example, 400 people a day are still dying in the United States. Do we just say, well, it's like the flu? 20,000 people, 30, 40, 50, whatever it is, 1,000 people a year in the US, or 5,000 in the UK, will die every year of this, and that's the cost of doing business.
So it's very hard to say that we're going to accept a certain number of deaths and live with that decision. It's going to be difficult for anyone to say that. But having said that, yes, there are people who die of infectious diseases like the flu every year. But what we should be doing is trying to reduce the number of deaths to the bare minimum. So if you have vaccines, use them. I think it's unacceptable that 1.5 million people die of tuberculosis every year, mostly in the poor countries. And that's because the world has not come together to solve that problem. So I think we've seen science and technology can help solve a lot of our problems, but we have to work as a global community. We have to work in a mission mode.
Right. We have to work. Why are we not, Baholo? Why are we singularly failing to do that? The pandemic is the best example of everybody knew what had to be done, but didn't do it.
Well, it's because, for the most part, everybody is focusing on their own little pockets. And when you are just focusing on your own little pocket, you think just by solving your problem, you will be immune to the rest of the world's problems. But we know that that is not the case. And no one is safe till we're all safe. So if you do not open up your borders, if you do not open up supply chains, then you will be as affected as everybody else that you are claiming to be leaving out.
We knew that and we still did it.
Yeah. We knew it, we still did it, and we are seeing it, if I may, seeing it also in this climate action space as well, that we know exactly what needs to be done. We know the science. Similarly with COVID, we know the science, but we know that in order for us to effectively transition, we need investments across board, not only in developed countries, but in developing countries more so, to deal with adaptation and resilience.
Come to financing of this in a moment. Mariana, you have a much... You wear your left views proudly.
That's a boring way to ask a question. In other words, and it's not the way that you're asking it, but the whole left-right thing,
don't worry, I can take the insult.
I think it's like so passé. What we're all interested in theory, is what the Secretary General was talking about. It's what Ngozi talks about, which is growth has not just a rate, but a direction. Talking about that directionality explicitly and asking why it is, for example, that in the 1990s we had growth, but it was very problematic growth, very financialized growth, which then ended with the financial bubble bursting. The question should be, what do we know that can help us set a direction for growth that is inclusive, it's sustainable, it's innovation-driven, it's driven by investment in both the public and the private sectors, going beyond also the ideology of state or business. What I believe in, coming back to the sexy bureaucracy point, is that we need to go beyond thinking, as many, I would actually agree with you, left economists perhaps have even thought, that at best the state is there to fix market failures. So the kind of Reaganite, Thatcherite, Trussite view is just, get out of the way, we don't need the state. A more progressive view is that the state is required to fix market failures. I think that's boring. That's not sexy. We need to be co-creating, co-shaping markets. Markets are outcomes of how we govern public organizations, private organizations, that when they're governed just to maximize shareholder value, it produces a particular type of market. So really talking head-on about the directionality, and especially what it means. Sumia talked about missions. What does an outcomes-oriented procurement, a policy look like? Why do we think until war comes or until COVID comes that we can just procure in a really boring, kind of low-cost way that doesn't actually then galvanize innovation?
Isn't it difficult to make major changes in the absence of crisis?
Well, the problem is if you do that, then the cost of the crisis is much, much higher. So the cost of inaction, not just in climate, but also in health, is much higher than the cost of action. We know that. So I just think there's not only inertia, but there's a power play. There's incumbents that are making profits by actually not making the kind of changes that perhaps we'll talk about today. So it's not just that, you need a war.
Who are they?
Well, first of all, the current inflation that we're witnessing, as we heard in the previous session, is not demand-driven. It's supply-driven, but you can break down inflation into three components: unit labor costs, wages; non-unit labor costs, so energy prices, but also profits. We have excess profits being earned in many sectors. This is also pre-war, so the profit share of global income is at a record level. The labor share is at a record low. Is that because labor became stupid and capital became super smart? No, there's lots of extractive kind of rent-seeking practices that we can go after.
Cameron, you're actually at the grassroots in a sense.
Yeah.
What you do is not theoretical.
No, we work with in the heart of communities with seriously disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged women and indigenous communities, where it has to be about that livelihood creation opportunity. And I think with what we're seeing, coming out of the pandemic, it's critical now that businesses globally go beyond, in terms of being just pure product and service providers. We have to be rethinking the role of big business and local business in being able to support communities and provide the kind of stability that could enable us for any kind of future shocks as and when they come. As you say,
if we accept, perhaps we don't accept, but for the purpose of this question, that big business is not sitting there like some Dr. Dastardly working out how they can destroy as much as possible for the greatest profit as possible. None of us on the panel think that, I believe. Therefore, where's it gone wrong?
I think it's too easy for businesses not to take responsibility for everybody in the wider supply chain. I think it's, as we saw in the pandemic, it was too easy. I mean, I work in the fashion space. This is a $3 trillion industry that is, fueled on the consumption of over 80 billion garments on an annual basis, of which there's over 11 million tons of non-biodegradable waste in the US alone. And it was too easy for big fashion brands to walk away from the enormous groups of people in their supply chains in the pandemic because they were third-party suppliers. And I think that's where we need big businesses to adopt procurement practices and procedures that actually are really human-oriented and human-centered, and actually thinking about how can we maximize that benefit.
I completely agree, because I think we have to think of trade and health being completely connected. If you look at what causes us to have good health, it's not living next to a big hospital. It is the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the diets that we have, and of course the housing. All of these, are determined by your trade rules and policies. So for example, trade in unhealthy food, we now call it the commercial determinant of health. It's impacting the health of the poor because these companies are selling unhealthy food at very cheap rates. And so for the poor, rather than afford a healthy meal, which they can't afford, they buy these very high salt.
And when I say that, I'm not trying to boil it down to a simple blame game, because it's an exceptionally complex issue. But there has to be some genesis of the problem there.
Yes.
So who do you blame?
Well, I think everybody. I think both. I don't want to blame only the private sector. I think governments have a role to play, because in the trade negotiations between countries, one government will pressure the other government not to block. And there are many examples where this has happened, where countries try to block an unhealthy food from being imported, and it's been threatened. So that food has to be imported. The same applies to tobacco as well. So these are all things. And the environment, we're talking about clean energies and technology. Why are these technologies not being made available in countries so that they can switch to greener energy? So it's not just about vaccines and drugs. I think it's all aspects that impact our health, and trade can do a lot to either harm or benefit.
So I completely agree with you, and I think it's actually very important that we start to think about our issues much more holistically. So if we're looking at trade, we're looking at climate change, we think about the role that the SDGs can play, or the action we take can play in us achieving our agendas, as in particular relation to the SDGs. So we cannot just talk about trade negotiations in a vacuum without thinking about the impact into the environment, without thinking about the impact of dealing with inequalities or poverty or any of those, because the reality is with globalization, as people even questioned it, with globalization, we want to be able to share welfare benefits. That's what we want to be able to do, to share welfare benefits. And we have to ensure that in action for climate change or in action within trade, we are talking about inclusivity. We're talking about the holistic agenda of SDGs. But most importantly, and this is my main thing, Richard, we need to finance the actions. That's the only way we move from ambition to action.
Don't worry, we'll get to finance.
I want the money, Richard, if it's not clear.
If you're looking at it from me, you'll be disappointed. No.
Yeah, so while we're all using these really important words, sustainable development goals, inclusion, sustainability, but we also have to go super specific and call out the actions that we want to stop, and also try to understand why they're happening. So it's not about blame, but it is about kind of getting a microscope. So even like the concept of, government and business have to work together. Look at the vaccines. AstraZeneca and Pfizer worked very differently. Right? So AstraZeneca actually accepted to keep the costs low, the prices low, to share the knowledge. Pfizer didn't. Pfizer, by the way, is one of the most financialized companies in the world in terms of things like share buybacks. $5 trillion have been used by the Fortune 500 companies just to buy back their shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. That's a particular form of corporate governance that even many CEOs are starting to question with this idea about purpose. But sorry, just one quick thing. On patents, because we've kind of brought this up, and this is so key to the WTO, it's not about being for or against patents. There's a reason that patents exist, to incentivize innovation. But when those patents are too wide, just used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, and too upstream, so that the tools of research are being privatized and patented, that hurts. That hurts innovation, it hurts inclusion, it hurts the ability of African countries to actually produce.
So how do you
vaccines.
protect the patented rights? I'm not sort of defending...
First of all, it's not a right, it's a contract. It's a contract for monopoly profits for 20 years. I actually think words matter. Rights sound like it's God-given or something. It's a contract. You're given 20 years of monopoly profits. The real question is, what does the state that gave you that monopoly profit get in return? And in the Middle Ages, we just had secrecy. So the whole idea behind patents, for example, was that you'd actually write down what you did, so that at the end of the patent, there's more diffusion and knowledge spillovers. If in the meantime you've abused the patent system and it's really just used for rent seeking, then the state doesn't get back its share of the deal. And I think we need to talk about in the WTO, the deal, not rights, as though there's a right to patent.
Well, rights in the sense that it's been granted by...
Yeah.
But could I just add, Richard, a lot of the vaccines and drugs that are produced today by the big companies are actually based on R&D that is financed by taxpayer funds. If you look at the budget of NIH, it's $42 billion a year. Now, the Moderna vaccine, the IP was all developed by the NIH scientists.
Yeah, but that's not an argument that really holds a huge amount of water, because when the NIH...
licensed it.
When the NIH gave the money, it knew the patented infrastructure that it was doing it under, and it could have made it a condition of getting the money to get the
That's
thing.
the point.
So who are you? Again, I used the word blame. I mean, whose fault is it? Is it the NIH's for not saying, well, listen, if we give you this 20 billion, you've got to do this? Is it the companies? Where would you change it?
The funding agencies can change, because in the contract, they can have an access provision which says you've received X billions of dollars for this product, you can sell it, but you have to make X percentage of your product available either to the national government or whatever, the international agency or whatever. I mean, these are things not just for the next pandemic, but I think in public health in general, we have to start thinking about how these contracts, there are good examples, there are agencies like CEPI, like DNDI, there are public-private partnerships who've done this.
Do you think... Marianne, and then to her, and then to yourself. Do you think they realised that, or it happened by accident? Do you think, particularly with the pandemic, when the NIH and the EU and all the various fundings was being handed over in the midst of the crisis, anybody thought, oh, hang on a second, at some point we're going to have a patent problem making this stuff in the developing world?
Well, one thing that's super interesting is that with the recovery programs that happen worldwide, some countries, I mean, this is sort of a different point, but it's about conditionality, and I'll come back to the patent problem, but some countries like France actually posed strict conditions on the bailouts and the recovery funds that went to companies like Air France and Renault. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions over the next 5 years. In the UK, 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. So that whole concept of conditionality, interestingly, has resonated. Now with the CHIPS Act in the US, 159 billion going to actually create semiconductors or chips at home. There are some conditions attached in terms of actually home production, but also the share buyback question, they've introduced that. But you could think about conditions in a much broader way, which isn't about like a stick on the head of a company. It truly is about how do you get the win-win kind of, result. It means you don't just give out money, subsidies, guarantees, or an industrial strategy around life sciences. You govern it back to my previous point, through shaping and co-creating the kind of markets we want. So the conditions that haven't been attached by NIH, I think it's out of fear. They just worry about their budget appropriations, and they're worried that if they're seen as meddling in the market, they might not get it. Whereas BARDA, for example, which is health money coming out of the Department of Defense, they're very confident because when they fund stuff, they want the soldiers in the field when they get sick to have it.
So, Cameron, I want to move to financing. Because let's be clear, we're not going to put the entire rights of the global trading system to bed in the course of an hour's debate. So I have to move it forward. On financing, where do you get your money from?
Great question. We generate our revenues obviously through product sales, through corporate partnerships, because a big focus of our work is not only on driving impact through our own supply chains and our own product creation programs, but also working with big businesses who also are serious about embedding impact and sustainability into the center of their strategy. And so working from our side to use creativity to support big businesses to move more quickly along that journey in driving impact through their own their own operations. So,
but are you a commercially oriented philosophy?
Absolutely.
Right. And what do you do when commercial imperative conflicts with sustainable or assistance of the other side of the coin?
Well, we only work with corporate partners where we're absolutely clear that they are committed to the sustainable objectives that we help them to shape or that they've already set. And so I think that's fundamental.
Financing. Go on, off you go. What's your problem with financing? There's plenty of money in the world.
Where's the money, Richard? I would like to see a minimum of $1 trillion next to me. The continent's need for adaptation and resilience is about $1.3 trillion between now and 2030. So that's what I need. And so,
who's going to provide it?
You know, first is unlocking the $100 billion pledges per annum that was made in COP15. But over and above that, we have to recognize that there is a role for the private sector and other non-state actors to play.
You say that with such a begrudging tone.
Why?
No, it's not you, it's you. I mean, we have to recognize.
No, we have to.
But isn't the whole point
It's been so interesting. No, it's actually been so interesting, Richard. In my new role, we're speaking to governments about the role of the private sector in financing adaptation and resilience. And there's been some resistance of, oh, but hold up, we don't understand the private sector's role in adaptation and resilience because adaptation doesn't generate ROI, which is completely false. We can point to adaptation projects within maybe carbon markets, land restoration, and so forth, that can generate ROI over and above financial, but also in giving you lungs and protecting, giving you oxygen. That is an ROI.
Mariana, in my morning reading this morning in the FT, there's an interesting article about, I forgot the shop's name, he started a new fund, a new ETF, that is specifically going to go against, he wrote Woke Inc., the gentleman who wrote Woke Inc., specifically investing in companies and forcing them against a woke, as he would put it, agenda. We'll find out whether the ETF succeeds or not in the fullness of time. But there's a backlash to what's being suggested.
There's a backlash to what's being suggested, but even when it's suggested in the positive way, I think there's underlying problems that we need to, again, make very explicit. So the kind of funds that have been released and dispersed to developing countries, but also in developed countries, have often been conditional. So it wasn't just neutral, here's some money. It's often been conditional on, for example, reduction of the fiscal space, right? Kind of obsessions around deficit figures.
Absolutely.
And even in Europe, after the financial crisis, there was, here's money from the Troika only if you promise not to increase your budget deficit, without actually focusing on the granularity of what should we be investing in order to determine long-run drivers of productivity, of GDP, and of course it's going to be public and private. What we have in many capitalist countries today is an inertial private sector, risk-averse private sector, short-term driven private sector, and a public sector that's a bit basket case, that at best, again, it's fixing markets, it doesn't invest in its own mind, it outsources its capabilities to consulting companies, it's not actually thinking in what we like to call a mission-oriented approach. We would have never gone to the moon without the private sector. There was 400,000 people involved, many different industries, aerospace, nutrition, materials, software. I've just written a book on this, and it wouldn't have happened with the current design of policy and how we think that at best government can de-risk the private sector.
But the argument against, or in favor, I'm not sure which, is that same with the pandemic. We would never have solved the vaccine issue without the private sector, admittedly funded by the state.
Right.
So I'm just thinking that really what you're talking about is the relationship between the two and how it's managed.
Yes, exactly. And this is why I think the treaty that's being discussed now at the World Health Assembly, it'll be a pandemic treaty or an accord, it'll be legally binding. And the 194 member states are discussing. It's open just now for comments from the public. I hope the WTO will also think about a treaty for pandemics in the future, because this is not the last pandemic we're going to see. We need to be prepared, the rules need to be written in advance, and we have to avoid all the mistakes that were made during this pandemic.
I'm going to pause for some questions from our guests here. Right, who has a question? Well, your 11 are not.
I am
Your
very.
11 are letting you down.
I'm very disappointed, Richard.
The first hand I saw over there, let me grab my earpiece. Tell us who you are, what your question, and by the way, you really, really don't want to start making a speech. Because A, you'll incur my wrath, and B, I have the power to switch your microphone off. So, with that in mind, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Please don't switch my microphone. I have two specific questions.
Oh, here we go, 2 questions.
Okay. I'm Catherine Udvise, representing the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution. So my questions are a little bit target.
You get 1 question, choose your best.
Okay, so for Professor Masakuto, I would like to know how we can balance the growth and the trade and the economic development in developing countries through the mission-oriented policies or programs, but at the same time allow that we have a sustainable environment and tackle current pollution issues.
You hear the question?
Yeah. So the point of mission orientation is to say you begin with the grand challenges. These are the sustainable development goals. But then at the national or local level, they need to be turned into kind of moonshots where you can actually answer yes or no, did you achieve it? To avoid the Greta Thunberg accusation of blah, blah, blah. In developing countries, those missions, but actually everywhere, those missions need to be formed in such a way that galvanize as many different sectors to invest and innovate. So, a sustainability mission isn't just about renewable energy. In Chile, for example, where I'm speaking to the current administration, it means actually transforming how mining is done, right? Mining is actually, copper is central to a sustainable growth path for Chile, but that means that how the, subsidies, guarantees, how the public bank, think of also Brazil with BNDES, how it disperses the loans, coming back to the conditionality, should be conditional on transformation. I'm from Italy. Our public bank has been part of the problem. It just gives out money to sectors that say, help, help, the steel sector. The steel sector in Germany recently received support from their public bank conditional on the steel sector lowering its material content. How it did it was up to the sector. You can't micromanage. But getting a transformative kind of agenda so that all the different levers of policy kind of amount to transformation and structural change and not just handouts and subsidies is incredibly important, for example, in countries that have been focusing on natural resources and commodities.
Can I add to that, Richard, quite quickly?
Yeah,
so for me, I think there's an additional layer of NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions, and a space for developing countries to include investable projects towards a mission of net zero. And when you start to look at it that way, then your national plans as well, development plans, get aligned to the mission of sustainability, but with a very strong focus on development.
Exactly.
So NDCs. Thanks.
Next question. Yes, at the front. One of your 11, I think.
One of my 11.
Who are you?
Thank you very much. My name is Launen Tara, and I am part of the Trade Experts. And my question is a follow-up to Boholo's call for finances to be crowded in from the private sector to really finance climate change. But we know that only 2% of global investments with regards that are flowing towards renewable energy have come to Africa. And we know that the perception of risk in Africa has been one of the primary hindrances of the capital flows coming into Africa. What do you believe is the one thing that African leaders and the private sector can do to help address this issue around the perception
Before
of risk?
the answer, why do you think it is?
I think there's an opportunity for us to leverage technology to be able to...
No, why do you think that only 2% comes? Why do you think there is a hesitancy on risk?
I think there's a great perception on the level of risk in Africa because of lack of transparency, information asymmetry on the actual impact that investment brings, and also the way in which we talk about the returns that we have on investments that are coming to the continent. So perception of risk remains high, although the reality of it is actually a different story.
How, well, you've invested quite considerably in Africa. How do you manage this question of risk?
I mean, fundamentally, it's about, proper due diligence in terms of our partners on the ground and making sure that we have every confidence that they're going to be able to execute on product creation and really respecting and supporting the craftspeople that we work with. And to your point, whilst the perception is that it's high risk, the reality that we found is that actually it's highly effective and highly efficient because people they're looking for that opportunity. They're reaching for that opportunity, and so as long as the infrastructure around that is managed carefully and with consideration, the results have been fantastic.
I usually like it when a non-African speaks to why they are investing in the continent and the issue of risk perception. Because for the most part, there is a premium attached with the perception that it's risky to invest in the continent. And we are challenging that because we know, as a matter of fact, evidence points to that default rates in Africa are much lower than those in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. So this perception that we are a lot riskier to invest in is just that, and we have to deal with it quite differently. And we have to see even MDBs and DFIs behaving in a manner that signals that investment in the continent is possible and there's great return, and the risk perception that we've been dealing with for decades is actually false.
How, the problem I have with it is, I agree with it, most of what you say, and then I think of state capture in South Africa.
Right.
And then I think of how arguably the most sophisticated economy on the continent, with arguably the best jurisprudential and financial system in place, with the strongest, arguably, democracy in place, managed to completely get caught up in one of the worst state corruptions of our time.
Well,
and I just ask you, I'm not asking you to defend one way or the other, but I'm saying there is evidence for this higher risk premium.
Yes, but why is it not the same in the US?
Yeah.
I mean, do I need to spell out the last 5 years? My point is...
Well, with respect, with respect,
yes.
Because there is organizations and institutions, as Barack Obama said 6 years ago, that were about to be tested to the nth degree and to a great extent succeeded.
Yes.
So I don't think your parallel is particularly strong.
Right, but I think taking one state and one precedent at a point to use that to paint red all over the continent is unfair. Yeah. Because if we're looking at Botswana and our institutions that have proven to be stable for over 50 years since independence, we've built them, and yet we are not even accumulating 10% of FDI into the continent. And our risk is very low. Everybody knows corruption is low. Everybody knows that our institutions are strong, but there is still this very high African risk perception that we get pulled into.
I completely agree, but also to solve it, then we need not just investment, because we've been talking about investment almost like through government, investment within government to create, again, these sexy bureaucracies. That's sort of like what I mean by that is dynamic capabilities and capacity within governments needs to be a result of dedication and a strategy saying, yes, there's weak states. Again, Italy, we exported the mafia. We know what a weak state is. The mafia came about because of a weak state. We need to invest. And maybe that's where the conditionality could also come. Right. Some of the conditions on the finance based on those countries that actually invest.
Yes.
Mariana, you keep coming back to government, and which I know that's a fundamental part of your general philosophy. How do you prevent government from becoming too big?
So again, I don't think it's about big or small. It's smart government or stupid government. So
it's
when you just have help, no,
with respect, you're passing.
Yeah.
Smart government, clever government. At the end of the day, how do you? Okay, let me be neutral in the phrase of the question. How do you ensure government does what you want it, what you believe it should do, and doesn't extend its reach?
Two things. One, it needs to, as I said, invest in its own capacity, even to have metrics to hold itself accountable. The BBC, by the way, has a metric. I know that you don't like CNN, BBC. The BBC has a metric within its organization around public value. It tests itself around a public value metric. No other public organization I know has that. And second, these investments that we're talking about, if they don't expand productive capacity, and it's just money, helicopter money being thrown at things, that's actually when you get inflation. If you're expanding through a vision, a green transition, goods and services that are green, there's no such thing as too big. Because the numerator of debt to GDP, you're driving the bottom, long-run growth with the direction.
I think you need all voices. And to answer this question, you need civil society, you need media, you need basically a vibrant democracy. I think that's the way, to make sure that the government is always making the right policies. They have to be challenged all the time, right? And they have to be challenged by people from all walks of life. But I hope that after the pandemic, that health will be on top of the mind for every political leader. And that every investment he or she is making, whether it's in industry or wherever, they think about the implications on health.
A question, did you want to?
Well, I would just add to that we need everybody, involved in this. We need the public involved in this. We need the public to be informed. We need the public to be interested and hungry to vote, and I think that's...
Hang on. That's a sort of that's the plaintive cry of Rodney King after the LA riots. Can't we all just get on? I mean, that's the sort of, that's the something must be done. Where do you start?
We start with the framework for action that we have in the shape of the 17 SDGs, and we make sure that everybody is trying to speak that common language so that we can actually make it digestible and so that we can actually link business with the general public and so that we can actually drive the agenda forward.
So why are we failing?
Well, first, I think it's because everybody is pointing fingers. But to get started, in a moment of crisis, you need a government to take leadership and signal the direction in which we are taking. So the failure comes out of lack of coordination and leadership that has vision of where it is that we want to go. So once you have vision in the public sector and there's vision in the private sector, then we will start to see action towards the spaces and goals that we're working towards. And then money.
We'll take some quick fire. I thought money would be there somewhere. Right, some quick fire questions. Come on. Make sure the microphone is on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, sir.
Thank you, all speakers. Since I think the bedrock of the talk was that our commercial activities should have a good social relationship. And while we are at the WTO, try to direct this to what WTO should be doing. And what I propose, and I want it to be answered, Ms. Swaminathan, Mazzucato, Professor Mazzucato could do it, is WTO keeps on saying, I'm now going to do a socially good thing. Health, gender, sustainability, and then it comes up with very blatant, stark.
Is there a question here?
It's a question that, what would you ask WTO to do in this regard? Would you suggest that WTO, while it makes a commercial agreement in area, talks to the UN agency involved, talks to WHO, UNEP, before it goes to sustainability?
I got it. Mara, start with you. Yes, you, ma'am. What would you have the WTO do?
The WHO, the WTO, and WIPO there's a tripartite, right? And the 3 director generals meet regularly, and there should be a program of action where we really think about an intellectual property regime which benefits public health. So it should be a win-win, and there are many mechanisms.
They would say they are already.
We have to do more. We are not there yet.
So I chair the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, only women economists from around the world. And our point is, if health for all is the goal, you need to backtrack and structure the economic system to deliver on that, which is intellectual property rights, it's the conditionality issues, it's the design of the partnership, coming back to the example I gave of the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer one. These are different types of projects. So I think one thing is we need to start looking at the project level and learning what works, what doesn't, kind of go away just from the abstract theorizing. And, look at what's happening now with the Financial Intermediary Fund, this Pandemic Preparedness Fund. It's, looks like a lot of money around preparedness for the next pandemic,
right.
But the structure of that finance is still problematic. So we need principles, again, going away from just the concept of rights, principles around common goods, and actually make them mandatory in terms of the structure of the contracts and the design of the collaborations.
Question right at the back. The gentleman right at the back. Yes, the one with his hand up. Come on.
So my name is Moga Kamaliani from the People's Vaccine Alliance.
I can't hear.
My question, given that during COVID, almost all of 2021, the problem with the vaccine was lack of supply. And we were living under the will, as Mariana said, one company does this, the other company does the other. So it's basically left to the will of pharmaceutical companies to decide who gets what vaccines when. How do we avoid this next time? Clearly, diversified manufacturing is the key, and we are talking about diversifying manufacturing is in Africa particularly. How do we ensure technology transfer is a must before next pandemic happens?
I hear your question.
Bear in mind, pandemics don't happen like that. They start with outbreaks.
We sort of got to that earlier.
Yes,
didn't we?
I could mention, the WHO set up several programs, including the mRNA technology transfer program, where we now have a hub in South Africa and 15 spokes. This should be extended to other technologies. Some private sector has come on board, especially the smaller companies and the biotechs, quite willing to share their know-how and expertise. The big pharma is not yet on board, maybe they will. But I think ultimately it's a pandemic treaty that will codify these things, and it's going to be a binding treaty. So at least for pandemic, technology does need to be shared as soon as possible.
More optimistic about our ability to handle the next pandemic, which you say is not an if but a when.
If we do things right in the next coming months and years, like diversifying manufacturing, like making new rules at the WTO and at the WHO, only then, yes, we have an opportunity.
Next
So
question.
think of the digital divide. All these kids in lockdown. Are we any more prepared this time to make sure that every kid in the world, when they're locked at home, still have their human right to education? No. Did zeroing the digital divide happen through all these recovery funds? No. So we're not more prepared. And inequality rose because of that.
Next question. Anyone who shot. Yeah, go on then.
This is Alcira Gomez from Mexico, Trade Tankemex and Trade Experts. My question is, you've talked about the government and regulation and the side of the big companies, but what about the consumers? Can any of the panelists share a little bit of the responsibility on the side of the consumers to be more inclusive and sustainable? Thank you.
Excellent question. One for you, Cameron.
Great.
Since your product, to a large extent, your products rely on an informed or at least willing consumer.
Absolutely, and it's our job on the part of designers, brand builders, and creators to work to support the general public to be more informed and better informed in terms of the choices that we're all making minute by minute, hour by hour throughout our daily lives and the impact that that's having on people and planet. But it's very much our responsibility as brand owners and designers to create products that showcase best-in-class materials and sustainable solutions, because I'm a firm believer that the general public absolutely wants to make those choices. We all want to see this progress and change. change. But too often the onus is put on the public to be to solve these crises as well. So it's critical that businesses draw on the growing investment that's going in the form of innovation to the materials that are available, and that's critical from a fashion industry perspective.
That's your briefcase, rather nice actually.
So my handbag, my briefcase here is made from recycled waste ring pulls collected by homeless people in the favelas of Salvador in the northeast of Brazil. We pay them an income to be able to collect that waste material. We work with women from Salvador, the most marginalized in the country, to be able to then do the construction. And we've had the privilege over the 20 years that Bottle Top has existed to see really how business can be transformational in the heart of communities. In Brazil, in Africa, in the Amazon rainforest where we're now working, and the public consciousness around these issues now is transforming. You know, the generations Y and Z, they will be the ones driving the purchasing decisions, by 2025, over 70%. So I think it's all moving in that direction, but it's for businesses to be able to step up and actually design solutions for the general public to be able to take action.
Richard, regulation can help. Like we have food labeling on food packets. Yeah. You should have, like in addition to nutritional content, and environmental impact.
Right. Yeah. There's a lady over there who, yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. We're talking about the next pandemic, but and we are not over yet. I mean, we have learned about the population in Africa that still has not gotten even the first shot of vaccines. But on the other side, we also have to deal with the consequence of the current pandemic. I mean, all the people that got ill and that are going to be suffering of several consequences that we're not aware yet of, that will have a significant cost also to the world health and the world economy. Is there something that is being thought on all these conversations between the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization to deal with the consequences of the current pandemic, and not only to think towards the next one?
I think that's a question for another moment.
I think so. Invest in health. Invest in universal health coverage.
And I want to do it this way. Normally, in this room are several hundred trade negotiators, correct? Mm-hmm. And you haggle, and you argue, and you disagree, and then finally, by consensus, you come up with something, which arguably might be the lowest common denominator. But we are in this room today. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to a minute each. If you were giving a speech to the trade negotiators in this room, not necessarily the presidents who you all talk to and this, but the trade negotiators who are executing policies set, what would be your message to them? Start with you, Cameron.
My message to them would be to focus in on the issues that matter to you as a person. You know, I think too often we get drawn into spaces where actually we're not talking from the heart. We're not talking about the challenges that we face in our immediate families and communities. And I think it's so crucial that we come back to that. And again, that's why our invitation with Bottle Top and Together Band to the world is to choose the SDG that actually resonates with you, stand behind it, think about how you can take action on that in your homes, in your immediate communities, and around the world.
You've got a minute to convince these trade negotiators to do something. What are you going to do?
Well, I don't want to sound like Extinction Rebellion, but I think the reality is that we are all digging our own graves with the kind of policies we have today. We won't have a planet, basically, that we can live on. And so I think we need to think exactly about ourselves, our children and our grandchildren. You know, what sort of a world do we want to live in? And I think science can provide solutions for us today, and science and the products of that science should be a global public good. And then we should believe in sharing.
How do you tell them to get out of their own way and stop being worried and just do something?
I think it's think about your children and grandchildren, about those children whom you know, not about some random, we sometimes talk in millions of people died, billions. It doesn't touch you, but that one friend who died of COVID, you'll never forget. So I think we have to make it very personal, and it shouldn't all, it shouldn't be about some abstract, really, but about what sort of world do we want.
Mariana, I'm giving you a minute.
I could do less. I kind of want to take the opposite extreme, even though I agree with what you both said. I think we need proper measurements, metrics that hold us accountable towards the common good. I don't think we have it. Pope Francis talks about the common good. I'm not religious, but if you hear his speeches and the encyclical, I can't even pronounce it, it's actually much more precise on what it means to make sure that the community benefits, bringing us away from this individualization. The last thing I'd say is the deal, the word the deal in the Green Deal is just as interesting as the green bit. Right? So green is the investment in all these different areas that we know need to transform manufacturing, cement, steel, renewable energy. The deal is a new social contract. And having a strong common good framing can help us get that social contract to socialize not only risks but rewards.
The DG was worried that you were going to say abolish the WTO.
Not as long as she's head. Once she resigns, we can talk about it.
Go hello. You've got a minute to get your money.
All right. Well, I won't ask for money, but I'll ask for ambition. I would challenge the negotiators here to think and negotiate for the world that they want to live in, for the world that they wish to govern. Because if you're always looking back to, we used to negotiate for these things in the past, and you're not thinking about where you want to go, you find yourself stuck in a particular place. So in order for us to get out of this inertia, we need to think, where is it that we want to go? What is the kind of world that we want to bequeath to the next generation? And we need to make this particular action right now. And the call is, you disrupt yourself or you will be disrupted. Whether we like it or not, the world is moving forward.
Are you an optimist, a pessimist, or a realist?
I am an optimistic realist.
And that is your panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. What happens next? Nothing. We're done.
Nothing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.